the origin of this was, in fact, well, the origin of the conference that you're all attending coincides with a project that I'm referring to as the Library of the Great Silence. And it's a project that I have been developing as a SETI artist in residence, and that I gave a SETI live talk with Seth Shostak, who has been the scientific advisor on the library, which was a conversation that our own Dagamarta group heard and led to a conversation with him in which we started to consider some of the questions that came out of the library that I'll describe to you in a moment, and that ultimately led to this framing that we have taken for some of the crises that we are facing in our society today. That is to say that we can potentially use habitability as a window into climate crisis and vice versa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, and I am going to go through a quick introduction to the Library of the Great Silence, and then I'm going to, as best we can do, given that there's really no possibility for true conversation here, I'm going to try to open this up to conversation. So bear with me while I attempt to share my screen with far too many windows open all at once. And I will then go on from there. So I think that I'm sharing screen, but it looks like the Q&A window is still popping up. Is that still in the corner? Can anyone tell me?
No, you're just seeing your screen, John.
Great, perfect. So I'm going to take a step back for those of you in the audience who don't know the history of the Fermi paradox, which has been thoroughly attacked in the previous session, but which I would like to bring back around for the sake of a conversation that I think can lead us into some interesting territory, even if it does not persuade many in the room that there is a paradox in the first place. So the Fermi paradox came about allegedly in 1950 when Enrico Fermi was having lunch with some colleagues, and they were talking about how the universe must be teeming with extraterrestrial intelligence. And Fermi famously said, well, where is everybody? And so, of course, this question was a little bit disturbing to the common assumptions of the time. That is to say that people assumed that any alien intelligence would probably be much like us, sending out signals, I love Lucy and all that, and probably also would have some sort of itch to go and to visit other planets. So as a result of the fact that no little green men were visiting, and also that we weren't hearing anything, this Fermi paradox came to be known as the Great Silence. And there are, as the previous panel has alluded to, and as many of you know, there are many explanations for the Great Silence. And they range from the fact that we, in fact, are alone, that the universe is not teeming with intelligent life, or maybe there's no life at all. It's also possible that when intelligence gets intelligent about being intelligent, that life forms stop watching I Love Lucy, and perhaps they don't need to take space shuttles and spaceships to be able to get around. In other words, it may just be that there's a short period where everything becomes obvious and then it no longer is. But the great filter is, to me, the most interesting of these hypotheses, not because it is any more plausible. After all, we have a sample size of 1 at this stage, but because it is potentially the most generative, and generative in a way that we're hoping as co-organizers of this conference will be more broadly. What I mean is that when we posit that there is some stage in a civilization where it gets to a level of complexity that it is likely to be apparent to other civilizations elsewhere in the universe, that level of complexity results in some event that is self-annihilating. This is deeply disturbing, existentially so, and certainly makes a lot of sense given that the Great Filter comes about historically within the context of the Cold War, and that we're talking about it today in the context of mass extinction and of climate change. But more broadly, it seems interesting because whether or not it is true, and whether or not there is any paradox at all inherent in the fact that we have not had any contact, nevertheless, it brings us into a framing of ourselves and our civilization that I think can help us to understand ourselves better. So the Library of the Great Silence is effectively an interstellar reference library. And the Interstellar Reference Library is intended for all beings anywhere in the universe to be able to share filtration events that they maybe have gotten by, because it seems that more likely than not, if there is a great filter, there probably is more than one. And it probably, therefore, would be helpful to any civilization anywhere to be able to share notes with others in terms of great filters that have been circumvented or surpassed. So the Library of the Great Silence is a space in which to be able to consider these transitions that potentially are self-annihilating, and to do so in the most open-ended way possible. By open-ended, that means that it is a library that is open to all beings everywhere. But at the same time, it means that for the beings who are likely to use that library in the short term, namely us, that it is universal to the extent that we are capable of thinking of universals, and that can potentially, even if it's only us in the library, can lead us into a new space, a new mental space. So when I said universal, I mean, we're not only using English here. I mean, we're not only using language. In fact, the library is not a library of books, but it's a library of things. And I've started to assemble some of the objects that will be a part of this library. And ultimately, over the course of this conversation, we're going to start to look at these objects as well as to nominate others that belong in the library. So the objects that I've selected, largely on the basis of the fact that I had them at hand, begin with the hand axe, an implement that goes back to Paleolithic times, and that was one of the first artifacts that really did transform the world that humans, or that hominids were living in. The library is intended to have as broad a range as possible, and to have objects that instantiate various transitions in ways that are going to be necessarily incomplete, but that nevertheless, because they are just things, because they are objects rather than words, that they can be studied without prior assumptions, or with fewer prior assumptions at least than would be needed if we were to be looking at books in English or any other language. So we have, for instance, fire as instantiated here in matches. We have gold, which has had a profound effect, not as an element, but in terms of how we've used it, in terms of how civilizations have come into power dynamics with each other. We have, of course, a very familiar object from here today, the face mask. And we have many more that I don't have represented here that range from substances, coal, fertilizer, trinitite, silicon, plastics. We also have, in the way of materials, dice, which have, through chance and the way in which they've operationalized chance and gambling, really have transformed society in various ways, arguably. The compass, the clock, pen and ink. I don't want to give too many examples because I want to open this up in a moment to bring others into this discussion about what the transitional objects are. But first, I want to say a little bit about how the library is intended to be used. And of course, this, like everything in the case of a library that's meant to be open to all beings throughout the universe, is somewhat of a guess as a starting point, and a guess that is meant merely as a gesture in the direction of co-discovery of what will probably be a much more interesting proposition going forward, a library that will be much more effective going forward. But at present, what we're looking at in terms of this library are these objects and ways in which beings throughout the universe, probably first humans, will be able to come together and to manipulate these objects in order to be able to consider transitional events and their relationship to one another and who and what we are, where we are today. So in other words, it becomes a way in which wordlessly, setting aside all the assumptions that are latent in English or in our language more broadly, it becomes a way in which to interact, for people to come together around existential questions that we are all facing, that we have faced, that we may face. And so simple machines, this idea that comes from the Renaissance that it's not exactly true, but it's useful once again, that there are elements to all machines and that they include the lever, the pulley, the screw. The idea is that these simple machines can be used as a way in which to express relationships based solely on physics, and that also geometric relationships can be inscribed in a library space where nesting and various other phenomena can be expressed. The idea is to get us outside of our assumptions, to get us into a space that is shared, where none of us have an advantage, where none of us can go based on previous instincts, on what our received wisdom might happen to be, in order to be able to open up a whole set of questions that we're all asking already, but that we're asking in ways that, in a sense, we're conditioned by our past. So the library is intended to be everywhere. And I started out here in Abruzzo, a region in Italy, where I just happened upon a temple that had been dedicated to Jupiter, that then fell into ruin and became a Catholic church that later was deconsecrated and is now once again falling to ruin. A space of transition that is like the transitional objects, a space in which potentially we can reflect on these sorts of events that are apparently how we become what we are, and therefore have embedded in them all sorts of phenomena, such as overreach potentially, or more benignly, cooperation. Cooperation, in fact, being one that we would like to figure out how we might better be able to promote. So this first branch was installed quite simply in Abruzzo, in this space, and is a sort of a prototype for what can be throughout the world done as a sort of set of libraries that each community is able to form on their own, that each community is able to come up with in terms of what objects belong and where those objects ought to be. And I'm currently working with a space at a university in Budapest on one of these, and I'm looking at a space also in San Francisco. But we're ultimately also looking ambitiously at a headquarters. The headquarters being at a place that will be familiar to many of you, which is the Allen Telescope Array on Mount Lassen. Probably the ultimate tourist attraction if you're an extraterrestrial, and certainly I've just been there recently, a great place to go, even if you're from Earth itself. And we'll be able to bring these objects into this space to be able to interact with in the present, and also ideally through deep time, whether it's us, other beings that replace us, other beings that come from elsewhere, if in fact there are beings from elsewhere in the universe. So now I'm going to open up to discussion and especially to nomination, because I believe that the nomination process itself is going to be one of the most crucial in terms of how we get into the sort of conversation that I personally believe we all need to have. about who and what we are and what we need to become. That this is through SETI as a framing, a form of applied SETI, that is through the lens that I come from, which is as an experimental philosopher and artist, a way in which to get us outside of ourselves and a way in which to reframe everything. So I'm going to end the presentation here, and I am going to attempt to use the comments and Q&A as best I can. It's a little bit challenging because I'm kind of here alone at the moment, but if anybody would like to put into, let's go ahead and use chat for the sake of simplicity so that I'm not looking at two places. And if anyone would like to perhaps take on the role of speaking for those who are, well, ironically silenced by the fact that we are in a Zoom seminar. Maybe Bettina, would you be willing to take on that role?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to.
So
right.
This is an experiment.
Jonathan, do you want to stop sharing your
Yes.
screen? And
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Where does that happen? I just lost. Stop
Be
share.
at the top. There you go.
Oh, there we go. So this is an experiment, and we're just right now looking for what goes into the library and why.
So would you like me to make a suggestion?
Sure, why don't you get us started?
I'll get us started. I think what would be really interesting is a string of a musical instrument, because I'm thinking about how humanity started with art. You know, we have evidence of art making that is visual. I'm imagining that there may be art making that was more sound-based. And I like the idea of a string because it is also mathematical, it's also frequency. So we've got that nice intersection between art and science.
No, I really like that. And I really like also what it suggests in terms of having an evolution, or at least what we perceive as being our own evolution in any given sector. So whether it's musical instruments or forms of energy ranging from coal to solar and beyond, it seems like that could be a really interesting way in which to organize such a library.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something. I think in the first panel, Michael Wong was talking about how technologies is sort of creating this global village and connecting all of us. I think art is doing the same thing and has always done that and has always connected us to ourselves and to others. So I think an artistic aspect should play a big role in the library. And if you have, I'm going to just go and keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat as well, if anybody else has any suggestions.
Let's put Mike Wahl on the spot. Mike has actually written about the Library of the Great Silence already for space.com, and therefore he's done more thinking about this than many. Mike, would you perhaps like to suggest some nomination?
Just in terms of what objects to put in there?
Yeah, what belongs in the Library of the Great Silence? It's a conversation that I've undertaken in Abruzzo with people who were living in this town that was decimated by an earthquake, and then quite recently. And so that earthquake loomed large. So I'm very interested in both a very local, you're in San Francisco, what comes from San Francisco, but also in the global, or if you've been on other planets, and I know that space.com takes us all sorts of places, that would be welcome as well.
Well, something that just came to mind just a second ago. I mean, you're talking about it being like a repository of transition. I mean, what about something that memorializes how we mark passages of our own dead, like something ceremonial? Could put like a sarcophagus from the ancient Egyptians in there, or an urn, or something that speaks to us as a species, how we mark passages. I mean, maybe that's too meta, but I mean, if you're looking for a document of transition, I mean, how we mark our own transition to the afterlife might be interesting.
We're already getting very meta because we are going to include one of the feeds from the telescope array at the Allen Telescope Array. So SETI itself seems like it's a very relevant.
Yeah.
How would you interpret that if you were a being from elsewhere in the universe, and how might that help to define which of these objects makes the most sense? Is it human remains? Is it the treatment of human remains?
Yeah,
I mean, get to that.
It would probably be human remains. I mean, maybe something. I mean, maybe cremains, and maybe that would tell them a little bit about how we're constructed if they want to analyze what the bones are made of or the chunks are made of and so on, but also how they're venerated. There's a lot of cultural information in there too, right? So, I mean, like, I don't know. I think it's just worth, because that's something that makes us, I mean, it doesn't make us human because I mean, elephants mourn their dead and so on. It's not, there's not something that singles us out, but it is a big part of us. And it was a big part of our transition in terms of our culture. And so, yeah, that just struck me. But yeah, I mean, and there are different layers of information in something like that. So.
Bettina? I'm sorry, but Bettina, are there others? I'm not watching chat here, so.
No, don't watch it. I'll watch a chat for you. I really like this. Lucy Victorious says, I would like to nominate a self-portrait of Rembrandt by Rembrandt as an example of artists who had the capacity to immortalize themselves visually, which kind of really beautifully dovetails with Michael, what was said. But I also like the idea of that selfie. That kind of tends to permeate the centuries and our need to look at ourselves and us as individuals. And you have that beautiful tension between the local and the universal as part of that library of the great silence. So maybe you can respond to the idea of the artistic selfie, the self-portrait.
No, it's very interesting. I think what we need really is to go all the way back to those handprints that are found in prehistoric caves, which seem in a way to be the first selfie, and to go from there all the way up into the present. There's no shortage of selfies today. Are you seeing others?
And I'm seeing more from a viewer on YouTube. I nominate the vacuum triode tube, and also transistor, a major transition in communication and task accomplishment from Peter.
So it's really interesting to think about, what are the technologies, not only because of the fact that they are, of course, transitional, but because of when we hold a mirror to ourselves, as Rembrandt did, but where we're doing so as a society, what it is that we see as being, what are we going to boast to mom about, in a sense. So it seems that almost in a way, everything that we're doing right now, or could do in a library of the great silence, is a form of Rembrandt's self-portrait, only writ large at a societal level. So it's a really interesting thing to look at those technologies and to look at them from afar. And I think that more broadly, what we've been doing so far in this conference and what we're hoping to do going forward is to be able to take that outside view to see ourselves from a very different vantage.
Jonathan, I was I've just raised my self-esteem in my own mind, because I actually had the same exact thoughts as Bettina. So if I'm thinking like Bettina, then I'm really feeling good about myself. But yeah, I was going to say, the vacuum tube and the transistor, and maybe the abacus before that, as critically important transitions, or representing very important transitions in human history. Also, maybe like the mud brick, which kind of represented the transition from dwellings based on natural environments and habitat like caves and forests to human-made structures, which was another, like the hand axe that you showed early on, where was a transformative point in human history to actually build our own dwellings. So, but so many wonderful ideas.
Yeah, and I'm right now in Tucson, which is a place of adobes and an abundance of bricks. Just going to maybe ask, as I see that Alice Gorman has joined us, and Alice is a space archaeologist who brings also a great perspective in terms of the deep time in Australia. Alice, do you have any thoughts for us as you're waking up for what belongs in the Library of the Great Silence? And Alice and I are going to be running a workshop at Flinders University next year. So it is apt perhaps that she have the last word before we turn it over to Bill and go on to the next panel.
Well, I wasn't expecting to have to comment in this panel, but perhaps something that is indicative, an object that is mass produced, decays easily, and will become part of the silence. And my favorite objects in this line are Ziploc bags and plastic cable ties. So they're ubiquitous on Earth. They represent something iconic about the contemporary era. And they are also very fragile and will decay into the silence that we're looking for or looking at.
That is a perfect way in which to round this up and to ask all of you to continue to put into chat any nominations that you have or to get in touch with us. And we will continue to build this library, branches all around the world, and watch this space or watch ATA for the headquarters that we hope will be coming soon and that we will be able to invite you all to visit.